Welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the cost-benefit analysis tool. Without further ado, I shall hand over to Jeff Park from Natural Decisions, who developed the tool, who's going to present on how the tool was developed and give you some insights on how you can use the tool within your agencies. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Deb. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk about this work. I'll start off by talking about the aims of the project. There were really two aims of the project. The first aim was to look at the types of tools that are used by fire agencies currently to set objectives and to evaluate and measure those objectives in terms of prescribed burning. And in doing that, we looked at a lot of different sorts of tools, but our particular focus was looking at them through an economic lens to assess the extent to which the different tools looked at benefits and costs of prescribed burning programs. I'll talk briefly about that piece of work in a moment, but the second aim was around looking at some case studies where we could apply a purpose-built benefit cost analysis tool to assess the performance of different prescribed burning options, and that's the main focus of what I'm going to cover today. So the first stage, which I touched on just briefly a moment ago, was we looked at about 20 different tools from across Australia that are used by agencies in the prescribed burning space, and this included decision support tools, fire simulation and risk assessment tools, etc. And there's a separate report that covers the findings of those particular tools. But in a nutshell, what we discovered from that piece of work was that there's really, at the time we did the analysis, there was very, very few, if any, tools that could support cost-benefit analysis. So that was why I suppose we identified that gap, and the second stage of the project was to look at developing a purpose-built tool that could use the inputs of other types of tools, such as fire simulation modelling, for example, risk assessment, where you could use those particular things as to a benefit cost analysis. So that's where we focused. So we developed a new tool. There's sort of two parts to it. There's a general framework, which I'll introduce in a moment, about how you would think about this problem if you've got different sorts of options that you'd like to explore from a policy perspective in terms of, which approach to a prescribed burning situation might have greater merit. Then how do you define the problem? What's the information and the data you need? And there are some concepts there that we discovered were fairly new to people who spend a lot of time perhaps in the fire modelling space or in actual operational management of prescribed burning. And then the second part of it was the detailed tool itself, which is it's a spreadsheet tool. It looks fairly daunting when you first get into it, but we've developed a pretty detailed guidance document, a user manual that helps you work through sequentially the types of information and data that you require in order to look at benefits and costs. One of the key things, and this characterises the work that our team typically does, is that we like to develop these things hand in hand with the end users. It's very easy to go away into a dark space and develop something and then give it to people and say, off you go and use it, but that typically doesn't really succeed. And so we think it's important to do it collaboratively, hand in hand, and that was a feature of this piece of work, and we're very grateful to both Mike Wouters and Lawrence McCoy, who will talk briefly, I think, a bit later about their experience, but in terms of working with their two agencies to come up with something that actually had practical use. An important point to make here is that the tool we've developed it's designed for strategic thinking. It's designed for looking at different sorts of policy options. It's not about use at the scale of an individual burn or a series of burns. So it's about thinking about different sorts of options and what merit they might have. We wanted to apply it to a couple of case studies, so we developed some criteria for the sorts of case studies that would work, and I'll talk briefly in a few minutes about the results and the approach to the case studies in both South Australia and New South Wales, but obviously we wanted to try and apply it into places where there was an ongoing threat from bushfire, where there was a combination of different values at risk, ecological, social and economic values, where there was actually interest from the agencies in terms of different sorts of options that they would like to test. And importantly, there needed to be a level of institutional interest and resourcing that could enable the agencies to work with us in the development of the tool and the testing of it. What we discovered as we went into it, which was not really a surprise, but there was a fair degree of new information that had to be gathered, and we had two very different approaches to that. In New South Wales, it was integrating some modelling work that was done, fire simulation modelling, whereas in South Australia the approach was more about expert input. But I think there was no surprise that it did require some pretty extensive input from the agencies and their staff to help us with accessing and inputting the data into the tool. And we had a number of workshops with experts in each of the case study areas. Okay. The other thing here is that I suppose the purpose of applying this across a couple of case studies was to test whether or not the tool could be potentially transferable and replicable to other sorts of environments. So I think Deb will talk briefly at the end about how to access the spreadsheet tool itself, but essentially it's a typical Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of worksheets, and we have a detailed user guide that you can use hand in hand with the tool. And I think we've actually tested this with a number of people. It's relatively, once you get into the drift of it, it's relatively easy to start operating the tool. The hardest part, I think, is dealing with some of the conceptual thinking that I'll cover in a moment, so that when you're actually chasing data and you're developing up your policy interventions that you want to test, you're clear about what the limitations and the focus of the tool is. So, in a nutshell, there are sort of three basic steps to using the tool. The first one is to define the geographic boundary that you're operating within. Now, that might seem pretty straightforward and simple, but in fact it's not. It's important to get that right. The second step is to define the existing fire management regime, what we call the baseline. And this is essentially a business as usual documentation of current activities. So it might be about the level of prescribed burning in different sorts of landscape areas, the different sorts of suppression activities that go on. But this was something that took quite a bit of work and discussion to get people's head around defining a sensible baseline. And then the third step was to describe the interventions that you would like to assess. And again, the interventions have to be really clearly specified, and they have to be things that are relevant and useful from a policy testing perspective. Okay, I'll just run you through now the sort of key elements of the tool. The first step is to describe the baseline, and that I'll have some sort of more specific examples in a moment, but that proved pretty important and somewhat challenging, I think, for in the early stages of the project, and we've developed some useful guidance in the report and also in the tool itself that can help people focus on the definition of that baseline. Then it's about looking at, within the geographic area that you've specified, what are the assets that are of interest. So this includes things like people, human lives, infrastructure, houses, residential houses, highways, electricity lines, etc., and also environmental assets. For each of those units, and the tool is set up so that it basically prompts you to look for those particular categories. It's a simple matter of then multiplying the number of units by the asset value. So there are some quite a bit of work involved in actually coming up with estimates of, for instance, with residential properties. What's the average residential property worth in the particular landscape area that you're interested in, and the number of units, etc. And so that'll help you calculate the total value at risk. Under the baseline situation, and this next step was again quite challenging to estimate, but under that baseline situation, what's the average annual losses that you would expect? So that might be, for example, half a human life per year on a long-run average, a number of houses, or a number of components of infrastructure. But that basically defines the what you would expect to lose under a ongoing business as usual case. And then the next step is to actually estimate what are the suppression costs associated with that baseline condition. Okay. Then we had an element of looking at what are the dynamics. So what might you expect going forward into the future? Because the key thing about the baseline is that it's not static in time. It will change into the future. So there could be a change in the number of fires that you would expect, a change in the number of, the extent of the losses, changes in population. So both of the case study areas that we looked at had, they're rapidly growing sort of urban areas with increasing population, and that means that you might have more people within that area over time, and also a change in the number of assets that are present, new houses that are built, etc. So there's the ability to change that baseline over time according to those trends. So that's all about getting the baseline documented. Then you come up with the interventions or the policy options that you'd like to test. So I'll give an example for each of the case study regions in a moment. But for example, one of the interventions might be to increase the area of prescribed burning on private land. So that would be the intervention. And then you would estimate what are the costs in terms of the change in the number of fires that you would expect, the change in the number of losses. Moving on to the next element, what might be a change in the number of assets in fire-prone areas as a result of the interventions. So, for example, one of the interventions we looked at was retrofitting houses, which does alter the number of assets that are vulnerable. Thinking about starting to quantify the benefits, we need to consider the benefits that will lose reductions in consequences. How long does it take for those benefits to arrive or to start to emerge? How long will it take for the maximum benefits to accrue? And also the time frame for the analysis. And these things can be changed based on the scope that you want to cover. Then we look at the costs of the interventions. So up here we've thought about the benefits. Here we're looking at the costs in terms of both direct and indirect costs. So for example, if you're increasing prescribed burning on private land, there will be additional costs over and above the baseline for that particular activity. So they need to be calculated, and once you've done that, you can actually start to, the spreadsheet will then generate the annual benefits and the costs, and those are converted into a benefit cost ratio. So that's an overview of the key steps that are involved in using the spreadsheet tool. Okay, so I'll just quickly cover the Adelaide Hills Case study. I'll let people absorb the information there, but it's about 60,000 hectares. It's a pretty mixed land use, rapidly growing area, high fuel hazard, and currently there's no prescribed burning or real fuel reduction activities on private land, but there's quite a bit of fuel hazard on private land areas. So this is a map of the case study area. The interventions that we looked at were compared to a baseline where there was a burning on public land, but no burning on private land. So that was our baseline. And then we looked at 7 different, the first 3 looked at an increasing area of burning on private land whilst maintaining the public land prescribed burning extent. So up to 8.1% of the private land being having fuel reduction or prescribed burning undertaken. For the next 3 options, we looked at a shift from, so we maintained the overall level of prescribed burning at the base case, but we shifted some of the public land burning to private land, and that moved from 20% to 40% to 70%. So in the last case here, you would have had 30% remaining on public land, but 70% shifted onto private land. So it's basically shifting the tenure mix of the burning program. And then the last one was looking at keeping of prescribed burning effort, but doing some additional weed control areas because there was a link between the extent of weed infestation with fuel hazard and risk. So they were the 7 interventions we looked at. This slide just gives an overview of the calculations and the estimates for the various steps. I won't spend any time on this. People can look at this at their leisure. I'll just move to the results. But basically, this table is summarising the key results for each of the 7 interventions in terms of the reduction in fire incidents for that particular intervention. So, for example, if we're doing prescribed burning on 2.5% of private land, the estimate was that reduced the overall proportion of fire incidents by about 1%. What's the effect on a reduction in the loss of lives as a result of that particular intervention, loss of houses, other asset losses, the reduction in suppression cost, because even though that is recorded as a cost, it's actually a benefit. If you can spend less money on suppression, that is effectively a benefit, and the intervention cost itself. So for this first example, what the overall result indicates is that if you were to undertake an additional 2.5% of private land prescribed burning, the benefit cost ratio is 3.29, which indicates that investment is actually going to return a benefit of 3.29 times the actual investment, which suggests that that could be a pretty cost-effective strategy. So if we look at the overall run of results here, you can see that for the first 3 strategies, which was increasing the level of prescribed burning on private land, there's an increase in benefits or the benefit cost ratio across those interventions. If you look at option 4, which is 20% shifting from public land to private land, that is also appears to be a cost-effective strategy. It's not as cost-effective as the first one, but it's probably worth examining. However, if you start to move it to increase that area to 40%, in fact, the benefit cost ratio drops, which suggests that, and there's a bit of an anomaly here, which we've never quite sort of wrangled out, but it looks as though as you increase the area of prescribed burning on private land at the expense of public land, there's perhaps a point where that the benefits aren't that great. And lastly, looking at weed control, that option just looks like a really not very sensible investment. Okay. So we then did a second case study, or in parallel did a second case study in the Hornsby Ku-ring-gai bushfire risk management area in New South Wales. Again, this is it's pretty different to the Mount Lofty case study in the sense that there's a lot more native forest and bush surrounding the peri-urban area, but a very high risk bushfire area. Currently, the level of prescribed, there's sort of two key elements to it. There's about 250 hectares of interface burning close to assets each year, and then a large landscape area to the north west, largely of this case study area, where there's roughly 550 hectares of landscape scale prescribed burning that happens annually. And there's a bunch of other hazard reduction activities that are undertaken as well that form part of the baseline. So there's the case study area. The sort of main population centres are here, and then we've got these landscape areas of bushland around it. We looked at some different interventions here. The first one was to actually just increase the area of interface burning, so focusing the prescribed burning close to the high value assets, so basically doubling that or more than doubling that annually while keeping the level of landscape burning roughly at the same level. The second option was sort of the flip side of that, so that was to roughly double the area of landscape burning but keep the interface burning at the current level. Third option was to use both of them, so a combination of 1 and 2. Retrofitting houses, and we specified the extent of that. Option 5, looking at increasing mechanical treatments like slashing and fuel breaks, etc., around in the asset protection zones. And then the sixth option was to actually say what would happen if you did nothing and you let the fuel accumulate to the maximum level. So again, just a summary of the inputs and the sort of key outputs for each of these elements, which you can look at your leisure. An overview of the results. There's a couple of really interesting results here. For example, if you were to double the area of interface burning from about 250 to 550 hectares, that looks like a really cost-effective option, which I think accorded with the intuitive understanding of the fire managers. Also, increasing the landscape burning gave you a pretty good result, roughly 5 times the benefits for the additional costs, but not as cost effective as this option. Combining the two gave you a similar sort of benefit cost ratio. Retrofitting, incredibly expensive, and the benefits versus costs of that particular option don't look that compelling. Mechanical treatment looks like a reasonably cost-effective option. And lastly, letting fuel accumulate looks like a really, even though there are some cost savings, the overall benefits are very negative, and so that looks like a very unattractive option, which again would accord with a common sense view of things. Okay, just to wrap up, and I think I've got a couple of minutes left, some reflections on the work. The thinking clearly about the baseline and specifying the baseline is was a major challenge, and this was our first real foray into the bushfire space. We've worked mainly in developing and applying these sorts of tools in a natural resource management space in the past, but this is the same sort of problem. Getting a clear understanding of what the baseline is was quite difficult, because at the end of the day what you're trying to do is to compare different options against that baseline, and so you have to be really it has to be really clearly specified. And one thing that the tool does, which we think is pretty handy, is you can actually account for the fact that that baseline can shift over time in terms of you can deal with different trends. Second point I'll make here is that it was actually quite difficult to get information on costs, which sort of surprised us, but we got there in the end. Thinking about the difference between intervention costs and suppression costs was a bit of a challenge. Third point was that there are some fantastic fire modelling tools, and they can be really useful as an input into a tool like this, but they're not sort of the solution in their own, and that in fact the contrast between the two case studies was that we used two very different approaches in terms of applying Phoenix modelling to the in the New South Wales case study, whereas in South Australia we relied on expert opinion. So it's horses for courses, and I think there's some good learnings from that. And I've talked about the last point, but going back to the one above it, I mean, one thing that was fantastic in both case study areas was that there was some really good dialogue between the local experts and those folks with strong expertise and experience in fire modelling and fire management with us, who really, we're complete sort of newcomers to this whole business. So I think that dialogue is important. Lastly, because this is a benefit cost tool, it applies some key economic concepts, which it would be fair to say, were a bit foreign to the audience that we were working with. And I think the beauty of something like this is it can actually bring together different disciplinary expertise of people, which is important. It does require time and effort to develop a shared understanding, and particularly in New South Wales, I think we put a lot of time in and had a lot of great input from Lawrence's team to help us develop that shared understanding. There are real significant limitations with a tool such as this in terms of the input data. We had, there are some areas of the data inputs that I think at the end of the day, we had to make some, best guess judgments about the data, but this was really testing the suitability and application of the tool, as opposed to thinking that the results that come out of it are the truth and that they would be applied in practice. But I think over time, if agencies could become really familiar and competent with the general framework, I think there is the ability to use it to evaluate different policy options, and particularly to look at the sensitivity around some of the data inputs. Yes. So how's that, Deb? I'm finished.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So anyone that's interested in accessing the tool or the case study, the case study is on our Knowledge Web under the National Prescribed Burning Guidelines and Frameworks tab, but the tool itself is under the Prescribed Burning Tools tab, and I'll just take you through to that and show you. So there's a user guide document and there's the spreadsheet there. I'll also put the slides from today into this particular resource as well. Just bearing in mind that the figures that are presented in the slides are only relevant to the areas where the case studies took place, and that they can't be extrapolated to any other place if you were wanting to use them for policy decision making. So now, have we got Lawrence on the line? Lawrence, do you just want to put in that secret code I sent? Okay, we might skip through to Mike. Mike, are you on the line? All right, I'm going to just unmute everyone so that Lawrence and Mike can talk. Just bear with me one moment. Lawrence.
Yeah, I'm here. Deb, can you hear me?
Great. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
So Lawrence is just going to give a little bit of insight into the New South Wales case study from their agency perspective for you.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I think it was a really worthwhile project. It wasn't an insignificant undertaking for us to go about it, but we put the effort in because I think, this cost-benefit analysis concept is something that we should be aiming to incorporate in future iterations of our bushfire risk management planning. I think, next generation we're looking to, quantify risk and risk reduction, and I think the next step after that really is to, quantify that risk and risk reduction in dollar terms. So, really interesting project. As Jeff said, it wasn't an insignificant effort to generate the inputs, and that's particularly evident with our agency databases. They don't readily record the variables required that we need as models, as inputs to the model. And as Jeff said, we approached it using Phoenix and the gridded ignition analysis functions within Phoenix, and that took a while to set up. Particularly creating creditable weather streams and creating the asset layers to underpin, to start the modelling and then obviously to underpin the consequence analysis. So we've done all that and we've got through it, as Jeff said, with some, in some cases we had to make some judgment calls, but I think. Although that, the cost-benefit ratio is significant, particularly if we do more burning on the interface, and it was an intuitive result. I think we wanted to explore that max fuel concept because, as Jeff said, we had this, we sort of had to come to a common understanding of what the baseline was, and I think ultimately we ended up having the baseline as our current fuels, but we wanted to explore, what happens if we did nothing? And it was an important story for us, and although you can't see it in the cost-benefit ratio, in our modelling, the return for effort, particularly when you're comparing max fuels to what we do more, there's a significant risk reduction in what we're doing when we compare it to what we currently do to max fuels, and if we do more, that proportional risk that risk reduction isn't proportionally reduced. But there were some important messages that came out of the modelling for us, in addition to undertaking the cost-benefit analysis. So, as Jeff said, the results really made sense from my perspective, and in particular, the benefit from increased burning on the interface, which really is consistent with some of the recent research that's come out of Uni Wollongong. So, Deb, that was my dot points.
Great,
happy to
thanks,
take questions.
Mike. We might just hold off on questions right till the end, and I'll just put Mike on, and if he's got any comments he'd like to make about their case study as well. Thanks, Mike.
I can reiterate both Jeff and Lawrence's comments about getting some of the data, particularly the cost data, where in a public sector environment we're tracking costs for different reasons, and so we had to actually go and dive into our budget data to actually try and find the level of data required. It was quite useful for us, and it sent us down a path where we actually did start to look at the costs of what we're doing in a much more detailed way. The other thing was to have two different contrasting landscapes. We have a much more fragmented landscape, so the case studies we were looking at were looking at how do we effectively look at the whole of the landscape, private and public land, where in other places there's a much stronger focus on public land, because that's where a large part of the hazard is perceived. The figures reflect the thinking and our previous government's thinking as well, in terms of extending some of the mitigation activities we do away from just public land and to support stronger mitigation in private land areas. So that was quite useful, and the timing was not quite right, but it certainly helped some of the projects that we have been running in that space.
Great, thank you.
It highlighted that through Jeff's facilitation, and I think until you're comfortable with it, you need a facilitator, but you can, using expert elicitation, you can actually get some reasonably good data if you have a room full of the right people. So expert opinion isn't necessarily a second-rate data source.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Does anybody have questions for Jeff, Lawrence or Mike regarding the tool or the case studies?
Yeah, Glenn Daniel from Parks and Wildlife in Western Australia. I'm just interested about that last point on modelling using expert opinion, and wonder if you could maybe comment on just a little bit about the process that you went through in order to derive some of the benefits for the model.
I'm just wondering, Lawrence, whether you might be able to make a comment and then I could follow on, but certainly the Phoenix modelling that was undertaken in New South Wales, that was a lot of effort from Lawrence's team to pull that together and basically to predict, obviously to link the change in the different sorts of interventions to the reduction in asset losses. So that was, that's effectively one of the key benefits, and then the other benefit relates to the reduction in suppression costs. But Lawrence, have you got anything you'd add there?
I guess where we didn't have the direct data, obviously we had to, make assumptions, and they were based on expert opinion from people who, for example, one of the things, we had to look into to answer, and it depends on the question you're trying to answer as well. One of the questions, as I said, was the building construction, and we had to really try and find out, well, how much would it cost to retrofit a house, which was a challenging question, to comply with AS 3959, and so we had to use, contact some people to try and find the answers to those questions, and at the end of the day, whilst it's not perfect, it's the best information you have at the time. Does that answer the question?
I guess I was also just interested in the process that Mike went through and how they applied expert judgment.
So we had several workshops which Jeff and Anna facilitated, and we tried to get as many experts in the room as we could, from an operational point of view, from a fire suppression point of view. Some of them we had to quiz out of the session because they couldn't make it, but through quizzing a number of experts in the same space, we come to a consensus, if you like, on what levels of benefit would be, or levels of cost would be, and then we could follow that up with looking at some of the actual cash costs as well as the non-cash costs. It was I call it a semi-formal process. There are, and Jeff might know more about it, but there certainly are formal processes around having almost a survey of experts and analysing that to get your opinions. We didn't quite follow that pathway.
I think the other comment I'd make is that given the limitations we had in terms of not over consulting with people, we wanted to be able to extract reasonable values, but you can then test those through sensitivity analysis. And one of the strengths of the tool, like a lot of these types of approaches, is you can look at which input values are more or less believable and then test the sensitivity of the results to those. So we have covered that to some extent in the report, but I think that's one of the future pathways that you'd want to look at much more carefully if a tool like this was going to be applied in practice in other areas, because clearly some of the input values you can be reasonably confident about, such as the number of houses and the asset values, whereas the consequence estimates in terms of whether it's informed by modelling or expert opinion, there'll be some pretty significant error bars on that. But at least the tool gives you the opportunity to see whether or not they have a big impact on the overall final result.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to put forward? Okay, well, I would like to then thank Jeff for his time today, and obviously his time into developing the tool, and also Mike and Lawrence for their involvement in the case studies and presenting here today. And we'll make this webinar available on YouTube as soon as we can for you. Thank you, everybody.